Long before the world knew the name Aksum, there was only the land, broad and ancient, cradled between the Red Sea and the Ethiopian highlands. Here, the soil was dark and generous, and the mountains stood like sentinels over the valleys below. The air, crisp and thin, carried with it the scent of incense trees and distant rains. Time moved slowly, like the shadow of the sun over rock. This place was not empty. It whispered with the footsteps of herders and early farmers, whose lives were etched into the earth long before cities or kings. They built no great monuments, but they knew the land, its rhythms, its dangers, its gifts. They followed the rivers that ran like silver threads through the mountains, carved terraces into hillsides, and raised cattle on the open plains. Theirs was a life of patience and cycles. The Ethiopian plateau, where Aksum would one day rise, was already old when the first stones were set. It lay along the great arc of Afro-Arabian exchange, a bridge between Africa and the southern Arabian Peninsula. Winds from the Red Sea brought foreign tongues, foreign goods, and with them, the seeds of transformation. In time, small villages became towns. These towns, built from rough stone and packed earth, clung to the high ridges and spread along riverbanks. From the northeast came whispers of a kingdom called DMT, a name now faded, its rulers forgotten, but its mark still visible in language and script. The people spoke a tongue that would give rise to Gez, the sacred language of liturgy and inscription. They built temples to their gods, and carved early forms of writing into stone. They traded with Sabaeans from across the sea, and learned the customs of distant kings. But it was not yet Aksum. That name, when it finally emerged, would belong to a city, and to a kingdom, unlike any other in Africa. Aksum would not be content to remain a quiet crossroads. It would become a power, both spiritual and earthly, standing tall in an age when empires rose and fell like waves. Yet in these early centuries, there was no empire, only land, and the quiet shaping of destiny. From these hills and valleys, from these stone dwellings and sacred groves, the kingdom of Aksum would one day rise. And with it, a new chapter of human civilization would begin. Before Aksum rose in stone and song, before its name carried weight across deserts and seas, there was another, older, more shadowed in time. It was not yet a kingdom, but the soil from which one would grow. Its memory lies buried among rock-hewn hills and windswept plateaus, and its name comes down to us in echoes, DMT. DMT was not a nation in the way later empires would be. It was a constellation of highland settlements, bound not by a single will but by shared customs, shared language, and the slow flow of trade. Around the 8th century before the birth of Christ, in the lands that would become northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, it began to take form. Its heart lay in a place called Yar, a quiet valley watched by sharp cliffs and dark skies. There, even today, stands a temple, tall, rectangular, built from smooth-hewn sandstone without mortar. Its design is not native. The lines, the cuts, the structure, they bear the signature of Sabaean builders from across the Red Sea, in what is now Yemen. But the spirit of the temple is rooted in the highlands themselves. In Yar's temple, the gods were worshipped not with images, but with words, carved in the South Arabian script. These inscriptions spoke of gods like Almaka and of kings whose names are now little more than breath in dust. And yet, they reveal a people reaching outward, learning from distant lands while anchoring themselves deeply in their own. Much has been debated about these origins. Were the Sabaeans colonizers or guests? Was DMT the child of foreign ambition, or a native people borrowing tools from afar? Today, many believe the truth lies in between. The highlands were never empty. Cushitic peoples, long settled in the region, met Semitic-speaking migrants, and over generations, a new cultural rhythm emerged. Words shifted. Beliefs intertwined. And a new voice began to speak. But DMT would not last. By the 4th century BCE, it faded from view, whether by conquest, decline, or simple transformation, no one knows for certain. Yet from its ashes, new polities rose. Small, local kings ruled valleys and ridges. And from among them, in time, one would gather strength. That name would be Aksum. And with it, the highlands would begin to speak with a voice that would one day echo across empires. By the turn of the 1st century before the Common Era, the silence of the highlands began to stir with a new rhythm. Out of the folds of mist and stone came the first glimmers of a power that would shape not only the destiny of Ethiopia, but the flow of commerce and belief across continents. The name Aksum began to appear, not yet as an empire, but as a presence, a gathering force nestled in the Tigray Plateau. The city itself grew where water met stone. Aksum was not chosen by accident. It stood near fertile plains, within reach of vital trade routes, and close enough to the Red Sea to feel the pulse of the world. Though it lay inland, its gaze was ever eastward, toward the ports of Agilis and Matara, and beyond them, the incense shores of Arabia and the bustling harbors of India. Trade was the lifeblood of early Aksum. Camels crossed dry plains bearing ivory and rhinoceros horn, slaves, and gold, salt and obsidian. These goods found their way to the port of Agilis, a humid gateway where foreign ships dropped anchor. There, merchants from Egypt, Rome, and India bartered in Greek, Latin, and Gez. Silk passed from China, pepper from southern India, glass from Syria. And in return, the world took the treasures of Africa's Horn. This growing presence was not lost on observers. In the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek-Egyptian navigator around the 1st century AD wrote of Aksum and its ports. He described a land ruled by a man named Zoskalis, a king of few words and strict discipline, but one who knew the ways of the Greeks. This mention, brief though it is the first written trace of Aksum's rise in the historical record. Yet Aksum was more than trade. It began to speak in stone. Stelae, tall, narrow monuments carved from granite, were raised above royal tombs. Some stood over 20 meters high, their surfaces etched with false doors and window-like carvings, symbols of power, gateways to the afterlife. These obelisks did not merely mark graves, they marked presence. They said, "We are here. We endure." In the hills around the city, smaller kingdoms began to fall under Aksumite influence. Through marriage, war, and wealth, Aksum bound the land to itself. It did not yet claim empire, but it began to behave like one. In these first centuries, the seeds of Aksum's greatness were sown, not in thunder, but in the slow and patient accumulation of strength. The highlands watched, as they always had, but now they looked down upon a land that had begun to awaken. The land of Aksum, once a cluster of highland communities and trading outposts, now began to speak with the voice of a kingdom. It was not a sudden transformation, but a slow and steady binding, valley to valley, hill to hill, until the patchwork of peoples began to move under one name, one crown. This was the birth of the Aksumite state. Unlike the empires of Egypt or Rome, Aksum did not rise with sweeping armies or grand declarations. Its foundation was quieter, rooted in terrain, in custom, in the careful art of persuasion and tribute. Local chiefs and lesser kings, long accustomed to independence, began to answer to a greater power. Whether by alliance or pressure, their banners fell in behind the Aksumite throne. At the center stood a monarch, but not one who ruled in isolation. The early Aksumite king was often called the Engus-Nagast, the king of kings, a title both grand and pragmatic. It acknowledged that others still held authority beneath him, but that he stood above all. This layered kingship was both a reflection of the land's complexity and a tool to manage it. It allowed unity without erasing the local. The tools of this unity were not only political, but spiritual. Though traditional deities like Marum, Baer, and Asta still held sway, there was already a shaping of belief that supported the throne. Marum, in particular, a god of war and kingship, was often invoked as the divine patron of the king, his name etched alongside royal claims on stone inscriptions. The state also began to take shape in administration. Inscriptions from the early centuries speak of governors, tribute collectors, and military expeditions. These were not just records, they were statements of order, of hierarchy, of law. The written word, carved in Greek or Gez, became a tool of rule. Coinage appeared too, small at first, and mostly in imitation of Roman types. But the very act of minting was powerful. It meant standardization. It meant the king's face in every hand. It meant that Aksum was not merely participating in trade, it was shaping it. And in this shaping, the kingdom grew. It reached beyond the highlands, toward the Red Sea coast, where Agilis became its window to the world. There, Roman merchants met Aksumite agents. There, the wealth of Africa flowed outward, and the silver and silk of distant lands returned. This was the beginning of statehood, not merely power, but structure. Not merely wealth, but the will to organize it. And in this slow gathering of authority, Aksum set its feet upon the path to empire. The hills watched, as always. And now, they watched a kingdom begin to rise. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the kingdom of Aksum had outgrown the silence of its early years. What began as a collection of hill towns and coastal ports now stood among the great powers of its age. Rome in the west, Persia in the east, and Aksum in the south, 3 pillars that shaped the ancient world. And Aksum knew it. The voice of this rising kingdom was coin. Bronze, silver, and soon gold, stamped not with foreign rulers, but with the faces of Aksumite kings. They bore names like Indubis and Aphilas, and their coin spoke boldly in Greek, Basileus, they declared, king. Some even read Basilius Axumiton, king of the Axumites, a claim that echoed across trade routes and markets from Egypt to India. No longer was Aksum a quiet partner in trade, it was a sovereign force, with a currency trusted far beyond its borders. The city of Aksum itself had grown in stature. Its stele rose taller, some towering over 20 meters, hewn from single blocks of granite. They stood not merely as grave markers, but as statements of power, false doors, carved windows, and the silent grandeur of permanence. These monuments were unlike anything else in Africa at the time, and their presence told every traveler, "Here, the kings do not die. They remain." Agilis, the port of Aksum, became a place of legend. Travelers from distant lands found its docks crowded with merchants and goods, ivory, frankincense, animal hides, and gold. Greek-speaking scribes recorded its taxes. Roman agents noted its ships. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written a century before, had spoken of Agilis as a place of promise. Now, it was a place of command. But Aksum's rise was not only commercial. It was military. Kings led campaigns beyond their borders, into Nubia, into Arabia. The inscriptions of King Ezana, carved in both Ge'ez and Greek, speak of victories over foreign peoples, of tribute taken, of land subdued. Aksum was not content to trade with the world, it sought to shape it. And so it stood, a Christianizing kingdom with pagan roots, an African power that minted coins in Greek, a mountain throne that touched the sea. It was no longer simply Aksum. It was an empire in the making. From the mountain strongholds of Aksum to the bustling harbors of Agilis, the lifeblood of the kingdom was trade. It moved not only goods, but knowledge, power, and reputation. Aksum's reach extended far beyond its borders, across deserts, seas, and languages, linking Africa to the heart of the ancient world. The Red Sea was Aksum's highway. To the north lay Egypt and the Mediterranean world. To the east, the ports of southern Arabia. Beyond them, India. And further still, the distant empires of China. Ships bearing the crescent-shaped sails of Indian dhows arrived in Agilis, heavy with silk, pearls, iron tools, and spices. In return, they carried away African ivory, gold, emeralds, incense, and exotic beasts, prized in Rome and Persia alike. The goods that passed through Aksum's hands were not merely materials. They were symbols. Ivory, gleaming and smooth, represented the strength of African herds and the prestige of kings. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from desert trees, were burned in temples from Judea to Byzantium. Gold dust, gathered from riverbeds and mines, funded thrones and wars across the world. Aksum did not only trade, it taxed. Agilis became one of the busiest customs stations on the Red Sea. Foreign merchants paid fees to dock, to sell, to move their goods inland. And the crown took its share. This wealth, drawn from trade routes rather than conquest, became the foundation of the kingdom's prosperity. To manage this commerce, Aksum relied on a multilingual culture. Greek remained the language of coinage and international record, while Ge'ez, the native tongue, flourished in religion and court life. In markets, many tongues mingled: Cushitic, Arabian, Aramaic, and others. The kingdom was a place of exchange, not just of goods, but of cultures. With wealth came grandeur. Palaces rose in the capital, stone-built with wooden beams and wide courtyards. Columns lined entryways, and underground tombs were carved with precision. The royal court adorned itself with silk, with glass from Alexandria, with pottery from India. And yet, even in its richness, Aksum retained the restraint of the highlands. Its power was quiet, its magnificence more stone than gold. In time, the flow of treasure would shift, new powers would rise, new paths would open. But in these golden centuries, Aksum sat at the crossroads of the world, gathering the riches of 3 continents. And the mountains, ever watchful, bore witness to its glory. As wealth poured into Aksum, and its name echoed across seas and sands, the kingdom began to shape not only its realm, but its image. Power alone could not hold an empire together. There needed to be a face, a spirit, something to bind mountain farmer and coastal merchant, warrior and priest, into one people. And so Aksum began to craft its identity. It began in stone. The stelae of Aksum were more than monuments, they were messages. Rising like giants above the earth, these monoliths were carved with geometric precision. False windows ran up their sides, imitating the facades of palace buildings. Some bore false doors at their base, as if the soul of the king entombed beneath might rise and step into the afterlife. One, known today as the Great Stele, stood over 33 meters high before it fell, likely the tallest single-standing stone ever raised in the ancient world. Others stood in ordered fields, watching the sun pass over the capital. Their alignment, their endurance, their silence, all served to remind the living of the king's enduring presence. But identity was not only carved, it was spoken and sung. The language of Aksum was Ge'ez, a Semitic tongue born of the highlands, related to both South Arabian and African roots. It became the voice of the court, the priest, and eventually, the church. Though Greek remained the language of trade and coin, it was Ge'ez that carried the soul of the nation. The royal court took care to present itself with sacred dignity. Kings traced their lineage to ancient heroes, some even to Solomon of Israel, in later traditions. Their rule was not merely political but divine, blessed by gods and, later, by Christ. Titles became longer. Inscriptions became more elaborate. Aksumite kings began to speak of themselves as rulers not only of men, but of the earth and sea. Architecture too spoke identity. In Aksumite cities, palaces and noble homes followed a unique pattern, high platforms of stone, accessed by stairways, with wooden columns supporting the structure above. The podium style became a mark of authority, setting apart the ruler's house from the ordinary. The same patterns appeared in churches centuries later, evidence of a cultural thread unbroken. Coins, inscriptions, language, architecture, even the alignment of the dead, all were woven into a tapestry that said, "This is Aksum. This is who we are." And so, in these centuries of strength, Aksum did more than rule. It remembered, it shaped, it became. In every enduring civilization, the written word becomes a vessel of memory. For Aksum, this vessel was Ge'ez, a language that did not merely speak, but carved itself into stone and soul. Through Gez, Aksum told its story, not in whispers or fading breath, but in characters etched to endure the centuries. Gez did not begin in Aksum. Its roots stretched back to the ancient kingdom of Dmt and even earlier, to the scripts of South Arabia. From those distant shores came a system of writing, angular, formal, suited to inscriptions and ritual. The early form of Gez borrowed these signs, shaping them to the rhythms of a new land, a new tongue. In time, Aksumite scribes transformed the script entirely. What had once been an abjad, a writing system without vowels, became a full-fledged syllabary, in which each symbol carried a consonant and vowel together. It was a shift of profound meaning. The spoken word was now more faithfully captured, and sacred texts could live more fully on the page. This script, known today as the Fidel, would outlast the kingdom itself. It remains in use across Ethiopia and Eritrea even now, in liturgy and learning. But in Aksum's time, it was a tool of kings. Inscriptions in Gez adorned the bases of stelae, the walls of tombs, the faces of obelisks. They recorded victories in battle, grants of land, proclamations of power. One king declared that he had subdued the people of the mountains and taken tribute from the sea. Another inscribed his conquests in both Gez and Greek, as if to speak both to his own people and to the wider world. Greek, too, had a place in Aksum. It was the language of coinage, of international diplomacy. Aksumite kings minted their authority in Greek not to imitate Rome, but to stand alongside it. On one side, the king's profile, crowned and solemn. On the other, a cross or disc, often with the word Aksumin, the Aksumites. The use of multiple scripts reflected the kingdom's dual nature, inward-looking in its spiritual and cultural roots, outward-reaching in trade and politics. At home, Gez was the voice of prayer, of judgment, of story. Abroad, Greek served as the bridge to empires across the sea. But it was Gez that would carry the deepest legacy. It would become the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It would preserve the scriptures, the hymns, the histories of a people. And it would remind future generations that Aksum was not only a power of stone and gold, but of word, and word endures. Long before the cross crowned the hills of Aksum, before churches rose and prayers echoed in the name of Christ, the people of the highlands looked to older gods, ancient, fierce, and deeply tied to the land. Their religion was not written in books, but lived in seasons, in war, in harvest, and in the rituals that bound communities together. The chief among these deities was Maram, a god of war and kingship. He was not a gentle figure. He walked with armies and judged the fate of battles. Aksumite kings claimed him as their divine father, protector, and standard. Inscriptions speak of victories by the might of Maram, and temples were raised in his honor. His favor, they believed, decided the fate of rulers. Beside Maram stood Bea, the god of the sea, a fitting figure for a kingdom tied to the Red Sea coast and its restless waves. Bea's presence in royal inscriptions suggests a maritime awareness, a recognition that the sea was both gateway and threat. Safe passage, storms, and wealth from afar, all were his domain. Another was Aster, a deity possibly linked to fertility or the planet Venus. Her name recalls goddesses of older Semitic traditions, Ishtar, Astarte, and hints at deep connections between Aksumite religion and the broader Afro-Arabian world. These gods were not abstract ideas. They had temples, priesthoods, festivals. Their images may have adorned banners in battle or stood in sacred enclosures. Animal sacrifice was likely practiced, bulls or goats offered to honor the divine. Fire, water, and stone played roles in worship, connecting the heavens to the earth. But their stories have not come down to us. No scripture remains, no surviving hymn. We know them only through the names carved in stone, the echoes left behind in royal proclamations. What we do know is that religion in pre-Christian Aksum was deeply tied to kingship. The ruler was not merely a political figure, he was the chosen of the gods, perhaps even a living vessel of Marum's will. This divine kingship helped unite the diverse peoples of the highlands, offering a common object of reverence and order. And yet, even as these ancient deities held sway, the world was changing. New voices, new faiths, were beginning to stir in the distance. In Roman lands, Christianity was spreading. In Arabia, Jewish communities flourished. Trade brought not only goods, but beliefs. Soon, Aksum would encounter a man named Frumentius. And the old gods, once supreme, would begin to fade. It was not through conquest, nor by decree, that Christianity first touched the soil of Aksum. It came quietly, borne by strangers across the sea, castaways from a world in turmoil. Among them was a young man named Frumentius, whose fate would bind him forever to the highlands. The story, preserved by later writers, begins with a voyage gone awry. Frumentius, a Syrian from the city of Tyre, was traveling with his uncle on a trading expedition along the Red Sea. Their ship sought safe harbor, but met with disaster on the Ethiopian coast. The crew was attacked, and most were slain. Yet Frumentius and his brother Edesius survived. They were brought before the Aksumite court, still pagan, but curious. The king, moved by their youth and conduct, spared them. In time, they entered royal service, and as the years passed, their positions grew. Frumentius, clever and patient, was entrusted with matters of learning and administration. Edesius, gentler in spirit, remained at court in a quieter role. When the king died, leaving a young heir, the queen regent kept Frumentius near as an advisor. It was during this time that he began to plant the first seeds of a new faith. He did not preach from pulpits. He did not build churches. Instead, he created space. He welcomed Christian merchants, helped them worship, and subtly encouraged the growth of Christian ideas. He acted not as missionary, but as steward, tending to the faith without forcing it. When the young king came of age, Frumentius left Aksum and journeyed north, to Alexandria. There he met Athanasius, patriarch of the church and a towering figure of early Christianity. Frumentius pleaded for a bishop to be sent south, someone who could nurture the faith already beginning to blossom. Athanasius saw something greater in the young Syrian. He consecrated Frumentius himself as bishop and sent him back, not just as a priest, but as Abba Saloma, the father of peace, the first head of the Ethiopian Church. His return marked the quiet beginning of Aksum's transformation. Christianity, once a foreign curiosity, now had a voice and a shepherd within the kingdom. And in time, the young king he had once served, a ruler named Ezana, would listen. The cross had entered Aksum, not in fire, but in kindness. And soon, it would shape the crown. The reign of King Ezana marks a turning of the ages, not only in the history of Aksum, but in the spiritual history of Africa. Under his rule, the ancient gods of stone and war gave way to a new faith, one of the word, the cross, and the gospel. Ezana's conversion to Christianity was not a sudden blaze, but a rising light, steady, deliberate, transformative. Born into a royal house that still honored Maram and Bea, Ezana was a child of tradition. Yet his upbringing was shaped by an unusual hand. Frumentius, now Bishop of Aksum, remained at court as his tutor, advisor, and quiet guide. Through stories, scripture, and the measured dignity of his example, Frumentius sowed in Ezana a new vision of kingship, one not only sanctioned by heaven, but humbled by it. In time, Ezana embraced the Christian faith. He did so not in secret, but in sovereign declaration. His inscriptions, once invoking the favor of pagan gods, now spoke of the Lord of Heaven, of the one God. He ordered the minting of new coins, where the familiar crescent and disk symbols of solar worship were replaced by the cross. It was the first time a Christian symbol appeared on coinage south of the Mediterranean, long before many European kings would dare the same. In one famous trilingual inscription, written in Ge'ez, Greek, and Sabaean, Ezana proclaims his victories over rebellious peoples and his devotion to God. He speaks not as a mere warlord, but as a ruler under divine justice, guided not by wrath, but righteousness. The old language of domination now yielded to a new ethic, conquest with conscience, rule with mercy. Under Ezana, churches began to rise, humble at first, perhaps built with timber and clay, shaped in the local style. Christian communities, once private gatherings of foreign merchants, now found public favor. The liturgy of Ge'ez began to take form, scripture translated, hymns composed, prayers lifted toward the sky not in fear, but in hope. Yet the conversion was not without complexity. Aksum was still a kingdom of many peoples, some bound to older ways. Ezana did not force the faith, but neither did he hide it. He ruled as a Christian king, publicly, unapologetically, and in doing so, reshaped the soul of the nation. Aksum now stood apart. It was not Roman, nor Persian, nor fully Arabian. It was African and Christian, one of the first nations in the world to make the cross a symbol of state. And from this moment onward, Aksum would walk a new path, not of idols and warrior gods, but of gospel and grace. With the cross raised high and his throne newly consecrated, King Ezana stepped fully into his rule, not only as a monarch of men, but as a servant of God. His reign, which likely spanned the mid-4th century CE, marked the golden age of Aksum, a time of expansion, consolidation, and enduring legacy. Ezana's early years were shaped by struggle. The kingdom, though prosperous, faced unrest on its frontiers. In the south, rebellious tribes defied tribute. In the north, the once powerful kingdom of Kush, now weakened but proud, stood as both rival and opportunity. Ezana, young but determined, led campaigns to secure Aksum's place as the unchallenged power of the region. His inscriptions, carved into stone stele and recorded in 3 languages, speak of these conquests with clarity and confidence. One of the most significant is the so-called Ezana stone, discovered in modern-day Tigray. In it, the king describes his defeat of enemy peoples, his suppression of revolts, and his destruction of Kushite cities. He makes clear that these victories were not for his own glory, but in service of the Lord of Heaven. Kush, once the seat of pharaohs and the guardian of Nubia, could not withstand the growing might of Aksum. Ezana's armies advanced along the Nile tributaries, striking at the heart of Kushite territory. When the city of Meroe fell, it marked the end of the ancient Nubian kingdom, a civilization over 1,000 years old. Aksum did not seek to occupy the land, but to remove its challenge. In this, Ezana stood not only as conqueror, but as the one who turned the page on a chapter of African history. Yet Ezana's reign was more than war. He strengthened ties with Rome and Byzantium, Christian empires to the north. Coins bearing his likeness flowed across the Red Sea, into the hands of merchants and foreign courts. His image, a serene, regal figure crowned and robed, became one of the most widely circulated faces of Africa in the ancient world. He also deepened the Christianization of his kingdom. Churches were built, clergy appointed, and Christian rituals integrated into royal ceremonies. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, though still young, began to root itself in the daily life of the people. It was not imposed, but nurtured, shaped in the image of the land it served. Through Ezana's leadership, Aksum became a new kind of power, both temporal and spiritual. It was a kingdom with armies, with trade, with wealth. But it was also a kingdom with scripture, with prayer, with a vision beyond earth and empire. And when he died, likely entombed beneath one of the mighty stelae of Aksum, his name remained not only in stone, but in the soul of his people. Ezana had not merely ruled. He had transformed. The conversion of King Ezana was not an isolated act. It was the spark that set in motion a slow, deep wave of transformation, one that would touch every corner of Aksumite life. In the decades that followed, Christianity moved from court to countryside, from royal inscription to everyday ritual. It was not imposed by sword, but carried on the breath of prayer, the rhythm of chant, and the quiet work of community. At first, the new faith spread among the elite. Nobles, scribes, and soldiers followed the king's example, seeking favor in court and alignment with the sacred order. Bishops and deacons, likely sent from Alexandria or ordained by Frumentius himself, organized the church's early structure. Their presence brought a new language of devotion, and with it, new customs, fasting, baptism, the celebration of the Eucharist. But Christianity in Aksum did not remain a foreign rite. It was planted in native soil and began to grow in local form. The Gez language became its vessel, used in prayer, scripture, and hymn. The architecture of churches mirrored the highland aesthetic, simple, stone-built structures raised on podiums, with flat roofs and dark, incense-filled interiors. The faith was not simply adopted, it was translated, reshaped to fit the rhythms and landscape of the people. Old beliefs did not vanish overnight. In rural areas, the gods of rain and harvest lingered. Customs bound to land and season continued, now framed within Christian teaching. Sacred groves became places of Christian reverence. Traditional festivals were reinterpreted through biblical story. The Church did not destroy the past, it absorbed it, baptized it, and made it its own. This blending gave the Ethiopian Church a unique character from the beginning, orthodox in creed, but distinct in practice. While rooted in the teachings of Alexandria, it developed its own calendar, its own saints, its own liturgical music. Monasticism began to emerge as well, men and women withdrawing into the mountains to seek God in silence, prayer, and poverty. Their presence added a new spiritual depth to the land. Over time, the Church became more than a religious institution. It was a keeper of law, a guardian of culture, a source of unity. It taught reading and writing, preserved royal histories, and sanctified the very idea of kingship. The king ruled by the grace of God, not only in name, but in truth. And so, the ripple of Ezana's conversion spread far. It reached the farmer tending his field, the merchant in the marketplace, the child reciting psalms in a stone chapel. It changed how the people saw their world, and themselves. Aksum had become Christian not just in title, but in heart. Before the churches rose and the crosses shone, the kings of Aksum spoke through stone. Across the northern highlands, fields of towering stelae, obelisks carved from single blocks of granite, reached skyward, silent and solemn. These monuments, some over 20 meters tall, were not only tomb markers or symbols of power, they were acts of memory, expressions of permanence in a world that shifted with wind and war. Each stele bore its own voice. Their surfaces were carved with false doors and window-like patterns, imitating the architecture of royal palaces. To the eye of the living, they appeared as homes for the dead, places where a king, though buried beneath, might still rise and rule. Some were adorned with inscriptions, naming the one who lay below or praising the gods of the old order. The most famous of these, known today as the Great Stele, once stood over 33 meters high. It rose above the city like a needle of stone, so precise in its symmetry that its fall, centuries later, was remembered with reverence, not shame. It likely marked the resting place of a great king, though his name has long since faded into dust. Others stand still, proud, weathered, leaning slightly under the weight of centuries. Together, they form the stele fields of Aksum, sacred spaces where memory was carved into the earth itself. Some historians believe these fields were organized intentionally, perhaps as ceremonial grounds or burial sites for noble lineages. But by the time of Christianity's rise, the tradition had begun to wane. The last of the great stele may have been erected in the early 4th century, just as the cross took its place on the throne. Christianity brought with it new symbols, new rituals of remembrance. Churches replaced tomb stele. Crosses stood where once only false doors had been carved. Yet the memory did not vanish. Later Aksumites, and their descendants for centuries to come, would walk among the stele with reverence. They would see not only the graves of kings, but the shape of a former age, an age of divine kingship, of gods of war and sea, of power etched in silence. The stones remained, as they do today, as witnesses, not to the faith of a moment, but to the enduring spirit of a people. Even the Christian chroniclers, though they no longer raised such monuments, did not condemn them. They understood memory is sacred. And in the highlands of Aksum, memory is stone. Across the shimmering waters of the Red Sea, beyond the incense-laden winds of Agilis, lay the rugged mountains and dry plains of southern Arabia. For centuries, this land, the kingdoms of Saba, Himyar, and Hadramaut, had been both partner and rival to Aksum. Trade bound them. Religion would divide them. And in time, war would follow. Aksum's first steps into Arabia were quiet: a merchant's ship, a diplomat's visit, a caravan bearing frankincense. But by the 3rd century, the Aksumite kings looked eastward with sharper eyes. Inscriptions from this time speak of rulers styling themselves as king of the Aksumites and the Himyarites, suggesting that their authority reached beyond the African coast, into the highlands of Yemen. How deep that rule ran is uncertain, but the ambition was clear. By the 6th century, the Red Sea had become more than a highway of commerce. It was a frontier of belief. In Himyar, a Jewish king named Du-Nuwas came to power. He sought to unify his realm under Judaism, a faith long present in Arabia. Yet his zeal turned violent. In the city of Nadran, home to a flourishing Christian community, he unleashed a brutal persecution. Men, women, and children were massacred for refusing to abandon their faith. The news traveled fast. When it reached Caleb, king of Aksum, it stirred him deeply. No longer was Aksum simply a Christian kingdom, it was now a guardian of Christians beyond its shores. Caleb, moved by both faith and duty, prepared an army. Ships were gathered, soldiers armed, and across the Red Sea they sailed, under banners marked with the cross. The campaign was swift. Aksumite forces overthrew Du-Nuwas, who, according to some sources, took his own life rather than face capture. In his place, Caleb installed a Christian vassal named Semyafa Ashwa, hoping to secure both peace and allegiance. For a moment, it worked. Aksum had not only defended its faith, it had become a protector of Christians far from its own borders. But peace proved fragile. Within a few years, a local general named Abraha rose against Semyafa. Though Abraha also professed Christianity, he declared himself independent. Caleb, aging and weary, sent a force to unseat him, but it failed. Abraha ruled Yemen in practice, if not in name, and acknowledged Aksum only with gestures. Thus, Aksum's reach in Arabia faded, not in disgrace, but in quiet erosion. Still, the story remained. A king had crossed the sea not for gold, but for faith. And though the sands of Arabia would soon be swept by new forces, the echo of Caleb's campaign lived on, in churches built by Abraha, in ruins still bearing Ge'ez script, and in the memory of a kingdom that once watched over two shores. Among the kings of Aksum, few are remembered with as much reverence as Caleb, a ruler who, in the twilight of the empire's strength, lifted the cross not as a symbol of power alone, but of sacrifice and guardianship. His campaign into southern Arabia stands as the last great act of imperial might from the highlands of Ethiopia, and it was waged not for tribute or territory, but for faith. Caleb reigned in the early 6th century, a time when Aksum had already embraced Christianity not only as religion, but as identity. The kingdom's alliances reached northward to Byzantium, where Emperor Justin I shared both creed and concern. When reports reached Caleb of Christian massacres in Nadran, carried out by Du-Nuwas, the Jewish king of Himyar, he could not remain still. The details are preserved in both Byzantine chronicles and later Ethiopian traditions. Du-Nuwas, having overthrown the previous ruler, sought to impose Judaism throughout Himyar. He viewed Christianity as a foreign threat and targeted Christian towns. Nadran, a center of Christian devotion, suffered most. Its bishop, clergy, and faithful were put to death, some burned, others crucified. Caleb acted swiftly. With Byzantine approval and likely naval support, he launched a full-scale invasion across the Red Sea. The army he assembled was formidable: infantry, cavalry, and ships laden with supplies. They landed on the Yemeni coast and advanced into Himyarite territory. The resistance was strong, but Aksumite forces prevailed. Du-Nuwas, cornered and defeated, is said to have ridden his horse into the sea rather than fall into enemy hands. In his place, Caleb installed Sumiafa Ashwa, a Christian noble who pledged loyalty to Aksum. Churches were restored. Christian worship was protected. For a moment, Caleb stood not only as king, but as defender of Christendom in the East. Yet peace was short-lived. Within a few years, a Himyarite general named Abraha seized power. Though Christian, he broke with Aksumite oversight and ruled independently. Caleb, determined to restore order, sent another expedition, but it failed. His strength was not what it had once been, and Aksum, far from home, could not sustain a prolonged war. Recognizing the limits of arms, Caleb withdrew. Some traditions say he abdicated, retiring to a monastery and giving his crown to God. Others suggest he died soon after, having poured the last of Aksum's imperial energy into his campaign. His legacy, however, endured. In Ethiopian Christian tradition, Caleb is honored as a saint, Babun Caleb, a king who gave his wealth, his soldiers, and his crown for the sake of his faith. Churches still bear his name. His tomb, in the highlands of Aksum, remains a site of pilgrimage. Caleb's campaign was the final blaze of Aksum's outward glory. After him, the kingdom would turn inward. But the memory of a king who crossed the sea for his faith would live on, not only in stone, but in soul. For a time, Aksum ruled not only the green highlands of Africa, but the sunburnt hills of southern Arabia. After King Caleb's great campaign and the death of Du-Nuwas, Aksumite banners flew across the narrow sea, in Safar, the Himyarite capital, in Nadran, the city of martyrs, and along the incense routes that threaded through the sands. But ruling across water is never simple. Caleb's appointed viceroy, Sumiafa Ashwa, was loyal and competent. A Christian himself, he sought to restore order, rebuild churches, and affirm Aksumite authority. For a time, his rule was peaceful, and Aksum could claim not only to have defended its faith, but to have established a Christian protectorate in Arabia. Yet loyalty, far from the throne, is fragile. Within a few short years, an ambitious general named Abraha seized power in Safar. He deposed Sumiafa and declared himself ruler, still Christian, still aligned in faith, but no longer under Aksum's hand. His coup was not violent. In fact, many welcomed him. He was a capable leader, and under his command, the region stabilized. Caleb, still alive, was not content to let this rebellion stand. He sent a second military expedition, but the strength that had carried Aksum across the sea once before had faded. The force failed. Aksum, overstretched and weary, could not reclaim what it had briefly held. But Abraha, though independent, did not break entirely. He offered tribute to Aksum, acknowledging Caleb's supremacy in name if not in fact. This gesture preserved dignity, a symbolic bond, a nod to the past, even as new power took root. Abraha's rule was notable. He repaired infrastructure, encouraged commerce, and became a patron of Christian institutions. The great church he built in Sana'a, the Yemeni capital, rivaled the glories of Byzantium, and he sent envoys to the Roman court. For a moment, it seemed that Aksum's spiritual vision had taken hold, even if its direct rule had not. Yet beneath this fragile arrangement, change stirred. Across the Persian Gulf, the Sasanian Empire watched with growing unease. Persia, Zoroastrian and powerful, saw Christian dominance in Arabia as a threat, especially one aligned with Rome and Aksum. They waited, watched, and planned. But for a brief, shining window, Aksum's dream of a Christian Arabia lived, not through conquest alone, but through the will of rulers who bore the faith, even as they walked their own paths. Aksum's shadow had stretched across the sea. Though it would soon retreat, its presence lingered, in script, in stone, in memory. Though the sun still shone on Aksum's distant ambitions, shadows were gathering from the east. Across the waters of the Persian Gulf, the Sasanian Empire, mighty, disciplined, and watchful, saw in Aksum's Arabian presence not only a rival, but a threat. For the Sasanians, faith and politics were deeply entwined. They upheld Zoroastrianism, a religion rooted in fire, order, and dualism, and they regarded the growing Christian alliance between Aksum and Byzantium with suspicion. The establishment of a Christian protectorate in southern Arabia, backed by Aksumite arms and Byzantine blessing, brought that alliance perilously close to Persian trade routes and influence. And so, they waited. And when the time came, they struck. By the 570s, the Aksumite hold on Arabia was already fraying. Though Abraha had ruled wisely, his death left a vacuum. His sons, struggling to maintain order, faced both internal strife and external envy. Sensing the weakness, the Himyarite nobility appealed to Khosrow I, the Shahanshah of Persia, asking for liberation from Christian dominion. Khosrow responded with force. A Persian general named Wariz led an expedition across the sea. His army landed in Yemen, equipped with elite troops and supported by local Arab allies. The battle was fierce. Aksumite forces resisted, but they were too far from home, too depleted after decades of exertion. The Persians swept through Himyar, ending Aksum's last foothold in the Arabian Peninsula. With their victory, the Sasanians established a Persian client state in Yemen. Zoroastrian garrisons held key cities. While local rulers remained nominally in power, true authority now flowed from Ctesiphon, not Aksum or Byzantium. This loss marked a turning point for the Aksumite kingdom. Its reach beyond the Red Sea was gone. Its prestige among the powers of the ancient world began to fade. And with the shifting of trade routes and the rise of new maritime powers, the Red Sea, once Aksum's great corridor of wealth, began to narrow. Yet the kingdom endured. The highlands remained rich, the church remained strong, and Aksum, though no longer an empire abroad, retained its dignity at home. But the Persian challenge had done more than end Aksum's overseas dominion. It had signaled that a new age was coming, one in which old empires would give way to new faiths, new rulers, and new paths. The winds over the Red Sea had changed. Before the tides of history turned, there was a moment, brief but brilliant, when the kingdom of Aksum stood at its full height. It was not merely a land of gold or war, but a civilization of structure, vision, and grace. From the mountain capital to the distant coasts, Aksum thrived as a kingdom balanced between earth and heaven, between tradition and transformation. At its zenith, likely in the late 4th to early 6th century, Aksum held a unique place in the ancient world. Roman historians, Persian envoys, and Indian merchants all spoke of it, a land that minted its own gold coins, carved its own stone obelisks, and carried its faith with quiet strength. Geographically, its domain stretched across what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, and at times, touched both Nubia and the Arabian Peninsula. Rivers and mountain passes linked its cities, while the great port of Agilis remained its eye to the sea. From there, Aksum's fleet sailed north to Egypt, east to Arabia, south toward the Swahili coast, and further still, into the waters of India. Economically, the kingdom was vibrant. Trade remained its lifeblood: ivory, frankincense, iron, slaves, textiles, and precious stones flowed outward. In return came silk, spices, glassware, and coins. Aksumite currency, with its Greek inscriptions and Christian symbols, was accepted in foreign markets, trusted and recognized far from its source. Culturally, the kingdom stood as a meeting point of influences. It drew from African roots, Arabian contact, and Greco-Roman refinement. In its architecture, we see symmetry and purpose: tall stone palaces raised on platforms, windows framed with care, stairs that climbed to wooden halls. Churches were beginning to replace temples, yet the precision of stonework remained unchanged. The church, too, had found deep roots. Under the guidance of bishops linked to Alexandria, Aksumite Christianity developed its own rhythm. The Gez liturgy took form. Monastic communities began to appear, quiet clusters of devotion in the hills. The Bible was read aloud in the native tongue, and hymns echoed through valleys once filled with older gods. At the heart of this world stood the Aksumite king, not just a ruler, but a symbol. His image adorned coinage, his words carved in stone. He was both defender of faith and guardian of tradition. He ruled from a city surrounded by fields of stele, by noble homes and burial chambers, by symbols of continuity. In this moment, Aksum was not only powerful, but poised, aware of its past, confident in its place, and unshaken by the storms that loomed on distant horizons. The kingdom had risen high. And though time would wear down its edges, this age, this zenith, would remain in memory, preserved in stone and scripture, long after the world changed. Even as Aksum stood proud in its golden age, distant tremors began to reach its gates. The kingdom, long blessed by geography and trade, now faced new winds, subtler than armies, but no less formidable. These were not storms of sword and fire, but shifts in the world itself, in commerce, in power, in belief. And slowly, the Highland Kingdom began to feel the weight of change. The first challenge was economic. For centuries, Aksum had thrived on its control of Red Sea trade, a lifeline of wealth that connected Africa to Arabia, India, and the Roman world. But by the late 6th century, those routes began to shift. The rise of Persian influence in southern Arabia, after the fall of Aksumite control, redirected traffic away from Agilis. Persian merchants, backed by the Sasanian crown, began to dominate sea lanes that had once carried Aksumite goods. Further east, the Indian Ocean trade networks expanded, bypassing the Red Sea entirely. Ports along the Persian Gulf and the western coast of India grew in power. Aksum, no longer the sole African gateway, found itself slowly edged out. The second challenge was political. The world beyond Aksum was changing. Byzantium, Aksum's Christian ally, grew preoccupied with wars in Europe and Persia. Its support for the Ethiopian kingdom waned. Meanwhile, the newly Persian-controlled Yemen blocked Aksum's access to key Arabian contacts. What had once been a triangular alliance, Byzantium, Aksum, and Arabia, had broken. And then came the third, the quietest, but most lasting, a religious murmur rising in the sands of Arabia. In the early 7th century, a prophet named Muhammad began to preach in Mecca. His message would soon reshape the world, but in these early years, he was simply a voice calling for submission to one God. Yet that voice would grow, and with it, the Islamic world would rise, redrawing the maps of faith, trade, and influence. Aksum, Christian and ancient, stood apart. It was not threatened directly, not yet, but it was no longer at the center. The world was beginning to turn without it. Internally, the kingdom remained intact. Its rulers still issued coins. The church still held sway. But the outer world, which had once flowed through Aksum's ports and bowed before its kings, was drifting away. These were not defeats, but slow undoings. The kind that come not with fire, but with silence, the kind that wear down mountains not with hammers, but with time. And so the highlands waited, watched, and endured. In the early 7th century, as change stirred across Arabia, a small group of exiles set sail from the burning sands of Mecca to the cooler highlands of Africa. They were neither merchants nor soldiers, but believers, followers of a new prophet, Muhammad, whose message of monotheism had unsettled the ruling tribes of his homeland. This moment, known in Islamic tradition as the First Hijra, was not one of conquest, but of refuge. The group of men and women fleeing persecution sought sanctuary across the Red Sea, in the land of a Christian king. That king, according to Islamic and Ethiopian sources alike, was the Negus of Aksum, sometimes identified as Amr or Ashama ibn Abjar. Though his name is debated, his deed is not. The story tells of how the refugees were received at the Aksumite court. They were brought before the king, questioned with care and courtesy. The Quraysh emissaries from Mecca, hoping to retrieve them, accused the exiles of blasphemy, of dishing Jesus and the Virgin Mary. But when one of the Muslims recited verses from the Quran concerning the birth of Christ and the purity of Mary, the king was moved. "This and what Jesus brought," he said, "are from the same lamp." He refused to return the refugees. Instead, he offered them protection, hospitality, and peace. They would remain in Aksum for many years, a Muslim community sheltered by a Christian king, in a land that had known both war and faith. This act, small in number but great in spirit, became a cornerstone of early Islamic memory. Muhammad, in gratitude, later commanded his followers to leave the Abyssinians alone as long as they leave you alone. And throughout the centuries that followed, despite wars and shifting empires, that early gesture of kindness would never be forgotten. To Aksum, it was simply an extension of its Christian ethic, to offer sanctuary, to defend the oppressed. But to the world, it was a rare moment of mutual respect between two great faiths, born not in diplomacy, but in the quiet dignity of a king. In a time of growing division, Aksum had opened its arms. And in doing so, it earned a place not only in African history, but in the spiritual memory of Islam itself. As the centuries turned, Aksum, once vibrant with commerce, voice, and sea, began to grow quieter. Not through collapse, but through withdrawal. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped back from the world stage. The coinage that once bore the faces of kings grew rarer. The harbors that had once teemed with foreign sails emptied. The highlands turned inward. This was not a fall, but a fading, an era of economic isolation brought on by forces both external and chosen. The changing trade routes were among the most immediate causes. As the Islamic caliphates rose in the 7th century, they came to dominate the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Muslim merchants, armed not with armies but with networks of faith and commerce, redirected trade through ports that Aksum no longer controlled. The port of Agilis, once the gem of the kingdom, declined under this shift. Whether abandoned, overrun, or simply made irrelevant by the new powers of the sea, it ceased to serve as Aksum's lifeline. Without Agilis, Aksum's connection to India, Persia, and Byzantium weakened. The flow of silk, spices, ivory, and gold, once the veins through which its economy pulsed, slowed to a trickle. The grand trade empire began to recede into the hills. Coinage tells the story in silence. For centuries, Aksum had minted its own gold, silver, and bronze coins, stamped with crosses, royal portraits, and inscriptions in Greek and Ge'ez. These coins had once circulated as far as the Mediterranean and India. But by the early 8th century, the mints had gone quiet. The last known coins were crude, often imitative, a faint echo of earlier craftsmanship. And so the kingdom adapted. Aksum turned away from the sea and looked inland. Agriculture, not trade, became its anchor. Highland farming communities grew in self-reliance. The church, now fully rooted in the land, filled the vacuum left by empire, guiding the people in matters both sacred and social. It preserved language, education, and law, even as political unity began to fray. To outsiders, Aksum seemed to vanish. Arab geographers in later centuries noted the name only in passing, if at all. For much of the Islamic world, the highlands beyond the Red Sea became a blank space, a memory of a once great kingdom now cloaked in silence. But Aksum was not gone. It had simply chosen endurance over ambition, withdrawal over defiance. It had turned its gaze from the world, but not from itself. And deep in its mountains, faith and memory continued to live. As Aksum withdrew from the coastal world, another presence began to press inward from the northern deserts, the Beja, nomadic pastoralists who had roamed the arid lands between the Nile and the Red Sea for generations. Their arrival did not come in armies, but in migration, slow, persistent, transformative. The Beja were no strangers to the highlands. For centuries, they had grazed their herds along the fringes of Aksumite influence. But as Aksum's coastal hold weakened, particularly after the decline of Agiles, the Beja began to move into lands once guarded by soldiers, once ordered by tribute. They came not with conquest, but with need. The climate was shifting. Grazing was harder to find. And the once patrolled borderlands of Aksum were now vulnerable. What followed was not war, but displacement. Aksum's links to the coast were slowly severed. The lands between the highlands and the sea, once dotted with way stations, farms, and trade roads, became contested ground. The Beja, following their herds and cycles of rain, claimed pasture and settlement. Aksumite villages faded. Coastal garrisons were abandoned. The lifeline to the outside world grew thinner. In Aksumite inscriptions and later chronicles, the Beja were often portrayed as raiders, a source of instability and disorder. But theirs was not a campaign of destruction. Rather, it was a reshaping, a natural response to ecological and political shifts that left the land open. The Beja did what all resilient peoples do, they moved to survive. For Aksum, the consequence was profound. The kingdom became increasingly landlocked. The Red Sea, once a path of glory, now lay behind a belt of unfamiliar power. Without secure access to its ports, Aksum could no longer trade with distant empires, nor defend what it had once claimed. Isolation deepened, not as a single blow, but as a slow drift. In the highlands, life continued. Crops were planted. Churches held fast. But something had changed. The world around Aksum no longer turned toward it. The kingdom was no longer a gateway, it had become a plateau, noble and still, ringed now by silence. Yet even as the Beja reshaped the frontier, the heart of Aksum remained untouched. The hills watched. The stones endured. And in quiet valleys, the spirit of the old kingdom lived on. As the outer world fell away, as trade faded, ports were lost, and the lifeblood of coin and commerce dried up, Aksum's center could no longer hold. The city of Aksum, once the throne of kings and the beacon of the highlands, began to lose its place at the heart of power. The kingdom, still breathing, began to move. The capital shifted, not suddenly, but in a quiet migration of authority. Scholars suggest that the royal court and its guardians withdrew further south or southeast, perhaps to Cuba, a lesser-known site nestled deeper within the Ethiopian highlands. The exact location remains uncertain, but the pattern is clear: the crown no longer ruled from Aksum. This shift was not merely geographic. It reflected the changing nature of the kingdom itself. The city of Aksum had once stood as a symbol, its stele towering, its coins gleaming, its port close at hand. But now, those symbols belonged to a different time. The stele stood weathered. The mints were still. Agiles was gone. And so the rulers, responding to both pressure and necessity, moved to where the kingdom could still endure, in the valleys, the fields, and the fortified hilltops of the south. This movement also reflects a broader turn inward. The new centers of power were more modest. No more great obelisks were raised. The architecture became more functional, more protective. Hilltop settlements, surrounded by terraced fields and guarded passes, became the new heartlands. Authority adapted to a landscape of caution rather than grandeur. And yet, in these new places, the spirit of Aksum did not vanish. Churches were still built, often from stone, with a blend of old and new techniques. The Gez language remained sacred, preserved in liturgy and manuscript. The monarchy persisted, even if its reach was smaller. The people, now more scattered, still saw themselves as part of a story far older than the generation they lived in. The shift of the capital marked the end of Aksum's classical age. But it also marked a beginning, a rerouting of the kingdom in its own soil, away from the ambitions of empire, toward the quiet strength of survival. The mountain held its breath. And Aksum, though changed, still spoke. Before the tides of history turned, there was a moment, brief but brilliant, when the kingdom of Aksum stood at its full height. It was not merely a land of gold or war, but a civilization of structure, vision, and grace. From the mountain capital to the distant coasts, Aksum thrived as a kingdom balanced between earth and heaven, between tradition and transformation. At its zenith, likely in the late 4th to early 6th century, Aksum held a unique place in the ancient world. Roman historians, Persian envoys, and Indian merchants all spoke of it, a land that minted its own gold coins, carved its own stone obelisks, and carried its faith with quiet strength. Geographically, its domain stretched across what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, and at times, touched both Nubia and the Arabian Peninsula. Rivers and mountain passes linked its cities, while the great port of Agiles remained its eye to the sea. From there, Aksum's fleet sailed north to Egypt, east to Arabia, south toward the Swahili coast, and further still, into the waters of India. Economically, the kingdom was vibrant. Trade remained its lifeblood: ivory, frankincense, iron, slaves, textiles, and precious stones flowed outward. In return came silk, spices, glassware, and coins. Aksumite currency, with its Greek inscriptions and Christian symbols, was accepted in foreign markets, trusted and recognized far from its source. Culturally, the kingdom stood as a meeting point of influences. It drew from African roots, Arabian contact, and Greco-Roman refinement. In its architecture, we see symmetry and purpose: tall stone palaces raised on platforms, windows framed with care, stairs that climbed to wooden halls. Churches were beginning to replace temples, yet the precision of stonework remained unchanged. The church, too, had found deep roots. Under the guidance of bishops linked to Alexandria, Aksumite Christianity developed its own rhythm. The Gez liturgy took form. Monastic communities began to appear, quiet clusters of devotion in the hills. The Bible was read aloud in the native tongue, and hymns echoed through valleys once filled with older gods. At the heart of this world stood the Aksumite king, not just a ruler, but a symbol. His image adorned coinage, his words carved in stone. He was both defender of faith and guardian of tradition. He ruled from a city surrounded by fields of stele, by noble homes and burial chambers, by symbols of continuity. In this moment, Aksum was not only powerful, but poised, aware of its past, confident in its place, and unshaken by the storms that loomed on distant horizons. The kingdom had risen high. And though time would wear down its edges, this age, this zenith, would remain in memory, preserved in stone and scripture, long after the world changed. Accelerated the damage. Without roots to hold the earth, the hills began to crumble. Fertile land turned to dust. Rivers silted. Valleys that once yielded grain and teff became dry and bare. This environmental decline did more than threaten food, it undermined the very structure of the kingdom. With each failed harvest, the bonds between ruler and people weakened. Tribute grew harder to collect. Local chiefs, no longer fed by imperial grain, turned inward, focusing on survival rather than allegiance. The once unified kingdom became increasingly fragmented, its authority dispersed across distant ridges and scattered valleys. The stress also deepened the isolation already taking hold. With trade diminished and ports lost, Aksum could no longer import goods it could not produce. Shortages became more frequent. Economic exchange, once driven by gold and ivory, now slowed to the pace of subsistence. Even cultural production, inscriptions, coins, monumental architecture, began to fade. Yet amid this strain, the kingdom did not collapse entirely. Aksum's people adapted as they had always done. They retreated further into the highlands, where rain still fell. They shifted their farming methods, planting hardier crops and tending smaller herds. And most of all, they turned to the church, which became both spiritual refuge and practical support. The Christian monasteries, scattered among remote cliffs and forests, became new centers of life. They stored food, preserved knowledge, and offered order in a time of uncertainty. The monks kept alive the Gez language, copied sacred texts, and maintained continuity in ritual and prayer. In a land where kings were heard less often, priests spoke more clearly. The environmental strain did not destroy Aksum, but it did transform it, from a kingdom of outward reach to a people rooted in endurance. From empire to remnant. From monument to memory. The land had changed. And with it, the path forward. In the long shadow of Aksum's retreat, the kingdom did not end, it unwound. Its central power, once firm and commanding, gave way to a scattered mosaic of local rule, regional traditions, and enduring faith. There was no grand collapse, no final battle. Instead, Aksum faded from an empire into a memory, but one still deeply alive within the land and its people. As environmental pressures and economic isolation deepened, regional lords rose in place of the old central authority. They ruled valleys and ridges, often claiming descent from Aksumite kings, invoking the past as a source of legitimacy. The monarchy itself may have survived, in diminished form, as a sacred institution, present more in name than in law. Communication across the kingdom's former territory became difficult. Roads that once linked city to port grew overgrown. Tributary systems dissolved. Yet despite this political fragmentation, a surprising cultural cohesion remained. The key to that endurance was tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, planted firmly in the Aksumite age, now became the backbone of identity. In monasteries tucked into cliffs and forests, monks preserved ancient manuscripts, copied scripture, and taught children to read Ge'ez. In village churches, farmers gathered for liturgy, feast days, and blessing of the fields. Though kings no longer issued decrees from stone palaces, the priests still proclaimed the gospel, and people listened. Art, too, did not vanish. The iconography of saints, the stylized depictions of Christ and the Virgin, the carved crosses, all carried forward the aesthetics of the Aksumite tradition. Stone churches were still built, often from older ruins, incorporating familiar patterns, stepped platforms, recessed windows, cruciform layouts. These were echoes, not imitations, living expressions of a heritage still revered. Even language endured. Though no longer the tongue of statecraft, Ge'ez remained the sacred language of prayer, chant, and scripture. Its survival, against the odds, speaks to a people who held not only memory, but meaning. This was not the Aksum of coins and obelisks, of foreign embassies and royal inscriptions. It was a quieter Aksum, one that lived in ritual, in rhythm, in soil and song. Fragmented, yes, but not forgotten. The kingdom had fallen into the hills. But in those hills, it learned how to last. Beneath the gentle rise of a hill in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, not far from the ancient sanctuary of Yah, lies the forgotten town of Beta Samati. For centuries, it slumbered beneath the soil, its memory faded even among local tradition. But in the quiet of the earth, its stones kept watch, and when they were uncovered, they spoke. Excavations began in recent years, and what they revealed was a window into the living world of Aksum, not its kings and monuments, but its townsfolk, priests, traders, and farmers. Beta Samati was no imperial capital, yet it bore the rhythm of Aksum's spirit, enduring, adaptive, sacred. The town thrived from the pre-Aksumite period through to the 7th century CE. Its name means house of audience in the Tigrinya language, a reminder that here, perhaps, authority once listened, and people once gathered. Situated between Yah and the Red Sea, it likely served as a regional hub, linking inland agriculture with maritime trade. What the archaeologists found was striking. In one area, they uncovered a stone basilica, likely one of the earliest known Christian churches in sub-Saharan Africa. Its foundation, modest in size but precise in form, suggests a community that had not only embraced the faith, but shaped it. Among the debris were incense burners, glass beads, and ceramic vessels, tools of both devotion and daily life. Nearby lay traces of older rites, animal figurines, bull-shaped symbols, remnants of rituals once offered to deities long forgotten. These finds do not contradict the Christian presence, rather, they reveal a gradual transformation, a culture in transition, where old beliefs lingered beneath new creeds. In the marketplace and homes, the signs of connection to distant lands were everywhere: amphorae from the eastern Mediterranean, beads from India, and a gold ring set with carnelian, engraved with the head of a bull, delicate and enduring. These were not the possessions of emperors, but of townspeople, quietly living at the crossroads of worlds. Most striking of all was a pendant, etched with a cross and the Gez word for venerable. It was not an object of royal decree, but of personal faith, a small devotion worn close to the heart. Beta Samati reminds us that history is not only made in palaces. It is lived in towns, in rituals, in ordinary days. And though Aksum's name may have faded from the maps, it lived on in places like this, in the shared spaces of worship, work, and wonder. The stones had waited. Now, at last, they spoke. In the twilight of Aksum's long story, whispers tell of a figure both feared and fabled, Gudit, also called Yodit or Isato. Her name drifts between legend and history, but her shadow lies heavy across the memory of Ethiopia. To some, she was a queen, to others a destroyer. To all, she marked an ending. The chronicles that survive, written centuries after her time, speak of her as a woman of fire and vengeance. She is said to have risen in the 10th century, from lands beyond the Aksumite heart, perhaps among the Agor people of the highlands. Some traditions claim she was of Jewish faith, others that she bore ancient resentments against the Christian throne. Still others cast her as a rebel queen, seizing power in a moment of weakness. The truth is clouded. What is clear is this: she struck at Aksum when it was most fragile. By then, the old kingdom had already withered. Its trade was gone, its capital shifted, its monuments standing only as echoes of the past. Into this weakened land, Gudit came with fire. The chronicles say she burned churches, toppled stelae, and slew the last king of Aksum, ending a dynasty that had claimed descent from Solomon himself. In her wake, monasteries lay in ruin, and the memory of Aksum as a living empire was extinguished. Yet even in destruction, ambiguity surrounds her. Some call her a tyrant, cursed in Christian memory as a usurper and blasphemer. Others see in her a symbol of upheaval, a representative of peoples long marginalized, rising against the fading Aksumite elite. Perhaps both are true, for legends often grow from seeds of truth and resentment alike. What is certain is that after Gudit, Aksum was no more. The monarchy continued in name, rerouted in new centers farther south, but the old capital, with its obelisks and tombs, became a relic. The age of Aksum, glorious and enduring, had finally passed into memory. And yet, even as her shadow darkened the land, it could not erase what had been. The stele still stood, leaning but unfallen. The Gez liturgy was still sung in hidden churches. The faith of Izana and Frumentius still bound the people together. Gudit could burn cities, but she could not burn memory. Thus her story remains, not as an end alone, but as a reminder that empires fall not only to foreign armies, but to the tides within, and to the figures who rise from them. Aksum had lived for centuries. Now, under Gudit's shadow, it entered silence. After the fires of Gudit's wrath, the highlands of Ethiopia entered a long silence. Historians call it a dark age, not because the land lay empty, but because the light of its records faded. For nearly 3 centuries, from the 10th to the 13th, little was written, little inscribed, little remembered in stone. What survives comes not from royal decrees or carved obelisks, but from fragments, legends, and the whispers of foreign travelers. The old capital of Aksum remained, its stele still standing against the sky, but its throne was empty. The dynasty that had once claimed descent from Solomon and Sheba was thought to have ended. Power fragmented into regional kingdoms, small principalities bound to the hills and valleys, led by lords whose names are scarcely preserved. Authority became local, not imperial. The Church, however, endured. Even in these dark centuries, monasteries and priests kept alive the Gez scriptures, the chants, the rhythms of liturgy. Hidden in the highlands, monks copied sacred texts by lamplight, preserving the language of Aksum while kingship faltered. In the absence of empire, it was the Church that gave continuity, shaping a culture of resilience. Beyond the highlands, the world moved swiftly. To the north, the Islamic caliphates flourished, controlling the Red Sea and the trade routes once vital to Aksum. To the west, Nubia remained Christian, though it too faced pressure from new Muslim powers. To the east, Arabia grew in strength, no longer a place of Aksumite conquest but of rising cities and new empires. Ethiopia, once central, now stood on the margins of history, unseen but enduring. And yet, even in silence, memory persisted. Oral traditions carried the stories of kings and saints. Families claimed descent from the Solomonic line, guarding their genealogies in secret. Pilgrims still journeyed to Aksum's stele, to its ruined palaces, to the churches where the Ark of the Covenant was said to rest. The land did not forget. It only waited. The Dark Age of Ethiopia was not a time of erasure, but of gestation. Beneath the quiet, traditions took root that would one day blossom again. The Solomonic dream had not died, it merely slept, awaiting the moment of renewal. And so, in the silence after empire, the people lived. They farmed their terraces. They prayed in Gez. They told their children of kings long gone. And though the world thought Aksum lost, its memory was already preparing to rise again. Out of the long silence, a new dawn began to rise. The centuries of shadow that followed Aksum's fall did not erase its memory, they preserved it, like embers glowing beneath ash. By the 13th century, these embers flared anew, as Ethiopia experienced a renaissance of memory, a revival of kingship, faith, and tradition, deeply rooted in the soil of Aksum. This renewal came with the restoration of the Solomonic dynasty in 1270, under King Yakuno-Amlak. Claiming descent from the union of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, he presented his rule not as something new, but as a rebirth of the old order. In this claim, the vanished majesty of Aksum lived again. What had once been legend became the foundation of legitimacy. This period also saw a flourishing of architecture, most famously in the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. Carved directly from living stone, these churches seemed to grow from the earth itself, a visible sign of endurance and faith. Their designs echoed Aksumite forms, the stepped windows, the podium structures, the geometric carvings. Though created in a new age, they bore the memory of the old, binding past to present. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church deepened its role as custodian of identity. It preserved Ge'ez as the sacred language, ensured the continuity of liturgy, and maintained the belief that Ethiopia held a unique place in salvation history. The Ark of the Covenant, believed to rest in Aksum, remained a symbol of divine favor. Pilgrims continued to visit the ancient city, tying the living kingdom to the Ancient One. Manuscripts began to appear once more, richly illuminated Gospels, Psalters, and hymns. These works, written in the flowing script of Ge'ez, carried both scripture and memory. Margins filled with bright colors, saints adorned with halos, crosses patterned with care. In their artistry, we see a people not only surviving, but remembering. This Renaissance was not a return to empire. Aksum would never again command the seas or mint gold for distant markets. Instead, it became a spiritual beacon, a kingdom whose strength lay not in conquest, but in continuity. Its memory was reshaped into a story of divine chosenness, of unbroken lineage, of a faith stronger than ruin. And so the highlands, once silent, sang again. The Renaissance was not the revival of Aksum's worldly power, but the flowering of its memory, a memory that would sustain Ethiopia for centuries to come. Though the stele of Aksum weathered and the coins of its kings ceased to shine, its truest legacy endured, not in stone or gold, but in faith. Of all the gifts the kingdom left to the generations that followed, none proved more lasting than the Christian tradition it had planted deep within the Ethiopian highlands. From the conversion of King Ezana onward, Christianity in Aksum became more than a religion. It was a national identity, a way of seeing the world. Even after the empire's decline, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church remained the unbroken thread that bound people together through famine, invasion, and fragmentation. While the crown faltered, the Church stood firm. The Ge'ez liturgy, born in the Aksumite age, still echoed in stone chapels and mountain monasteries. Priests chanted the psalms, read the Gospels aloud, and performed the Eucharist in the same words that Frumentius had once taught. Children learned their letters not for commerce or record, but to read Scripture. Manuscripts, copied patiently by monks, became the libraries of a nation, each page a vessel of memory. The Church also preserved Aksumite traditions in ritual and architecture. The step podium, once the base of palaces and temples, reappeared in churches. The tall, narrow windows of Aksumite halls became the framed crosses of sacred spaces. Even in their new Christian form, these designs whispered of the Old Kingdom, reminding worshippers that they stood on holy ground made sacred by centuries. Pilgrimage to Aksum itself remained central. Though its political glory was gone, the city lived on as a spiritual capital. It was there, tradition held, that the Ark of the Covenant rested, a claim that lent Ethiopia a unique role in salvation history. To kneel in Aksum was to touch both the memory of the past and the presence of the divine. In this way, the legacy of Aksum in faith became greater than its empire had ever been. Empires rise and fall, but liturgy endures. Trade routes shift, but prayer remains. The kingdom's stele stood as silent witnesses, but its faith remained alive, spoken aloud each dawn in the highland air. Through the Church, Aksum became eternal, not as a power of armies, but as a kingdom of God, remembered in every prayer, every hymn, every carved cross. And thus, the stones of Aksum did not only whisper of what had been. They proclaimed what would always remain. Though the kingdom of Aksum no longer sent armies across seas or minted coins of gold, its spirit lived on in the everyday fabric of Ethiopian life. Its cultural continuities, the threads that bound past to present, remained woven into language, art, ritual, and memory. Through these, Aksum did not die, it transformed. The most enduring thread was language. Gez, once the courtly tongue of kings and scribes, survived as the sacred language of the church. Even as spoken dialects shifted into Amharic, Tigrinya, and others, Gez remained the voice of prayer and scripture. Chanted in deep tones within stone chapels, it carried the echo of Aksum's inscriptions, preserving the rhythm of an ancient world. Art, too, bore the mark of continuity. The iconography of Aksumite Christianity, rooted in Byzantine influence yet distinctly local, grew into a style uniquely Ethiopian. Saints and angels were depicted with wide, solemn eyes, their faces framed in bold lines. Crosses were carved with intricate patterns, reflecting both the geometry of Aksumite stele and the creativity of highland craftsmen. This visual language endured for centuries, appearing in manuscripts, wood carvings, and painted church walls. Architecture carried forward the memory of empire. The podium-style structures of Aksum, stone foundations with layered platforms, reappeared in later churches. The window frames and recessed carvings of Aksumite palaces inspired the designs of rock-hewn sanctuaries in Lalibela. Even in distant centuries, builders drew unconsciously from the forms of their ancestors, tying their present to Aksum's past. Music and liturgy also linked the ages. The chant tradition of the Ethiopian Church, said to be codified by Saint Yerd in the 6th century, endured as a living art. Its modes and rhythms, performed with sistra and drums, echoed through villages and monasteries alike. Each note was not only worship but remembrance, an oral monument as enduring as stone. Even political identity carried Aksumite threads. Later rulers, whether Solomonic emperors or regional lords, traced their legitimacy back to Aksum. To rule Ethiopia was to claim descent, not just from Solomon, but from Ezana and the kings of Aksum. In this way, the kingdom lived on as a symbol of continuity, even when its borders were long gone. Thus, Aksum's cultural legacy was not static relic, but living tradition. It flowed in speech, in song, in carved cross and painted page. It endured not as an echo, but as a pulse, steady, present, guiding each generation. The empire was gone. The culture remained. And in that endurance lay Aksum's truest strength. In the long story of human civilization, few kingdoms have held a place so vital yet so often overlooked as Aksum. Rising in the shadow of Rome and Persia, flourishing in the age of Byzantium, and enduring into the dawn of Islam, Aksum stood as one of the great powers of the ancient world. It was not a periphery, it was a pillar, part of the very framework of late antiquity. Contemporaries knew it so. A Roman merchant's manual, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, listed Aksum alongside the wealthiest ports of the Red Sea. Later, a Persian prophet spoke of it as one of the four great kingdoms of the earth, equal in stature to Persia, Rome, and China. In its time, Aksum was not seen as remote Africa, it was seen as central, as connected, as mighty. Its contributions were many. Economically, it commanded trade routes that tied together Africa, Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean. Its ivory was prized in Rome, its gold circulated in Byzantine markets, its coins have been found as far as India. Politically, it influenced both sides of the Red Sea, intervening in Yemen and shaping the destiny of Arabia before the rise of Islam. Spiritually, it was one of the first nations to embrace Christianity as a state faith, making it a cornerstone of global religious history. Yet Aksum's place was not merely in what it gave to others. It also stood as a bridge between Africa and Asia, between the old gods and the new faith, between empire and endurance. It was a kingdom that proved Africa was not silent in antiquity, but vibrant, innovative, and connected to the great currents of the world. Even in decline, Aksum mattered. By offering refuge to the first Muslims in the Hijra, it left a mark on Islamic memory. By preserving Christianity through centuries of isolation, it became a unique witness to the endurance of faith. And by passing on its traditions, language, art, architecture, it ensured that its story did not end with empire, but lived on in culture. In world history, Aksum is both monument and mirror, a monument to Africa's role in the ancient world, and a mirror showing how civilizations rise, flourish, adapt, and endure. Its stones still stand, its language still lives, its faith still guides millions. Few kingdoms of antiquity can claim so unbroken a legacy. And so, Aksum takes its rightful place, not in the margins, but in the center of humanity's shared past. Though centuries have passed since Aksum's kings ruled and its ships sailed the Red Sea, its presence endures in stone and soil. Across the Ethiopian highlands, the material echoes of Aksum remain, not as ruins of a forgotten people, but as living witnesses, drawing pilgrims, scholars, and memory alike. The most striking are the steely fields of Aksum. Tall, slender monoliths carved from granite still rise above the earth, some leaning, some fallen, all solemn. The largest, broken in antiquity, once stood over 30 meters tall, a marvel unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. These stelae are not mute stones. They tell of kings who sought eternity, of artisans who mastered weight and symmetry, of a culture that honored both life and afterlife in enduring form. Nearby lie the royal tombs, cut deep into the bedrock, their entrances framed with false doors. Though long plundered, their silence carries the dignity of a vanished order. Standing within them, one feels both the grandeur of empire and the humility of time. At Yar, older still, rises the Temple of Al-Makka, its walls built of massive sandstone blocks laid with precision, unmortared, yet strong after more than 2,000 years. Here, one sees the bridge from pre-Aksumite ritual to the kingdom that followed, a reminder that Aksum's story was not born suddenly, but led upon centuries of devotion. In the countryside, discoveries like Beta Samadhi reveal the texture of ordinary life, basilicas, beads, amphorae, pendants etched with crosses. These finds remind us that Aksum was not only its kings, but its people, traders, farmers, worshippers, craftsmen. Even far from Ethiopia, material echoes exist. Aksumite coins, bearing crosses and royal profiles, have been unearthed in India, in the Arabian Peninsula, and along the Nile. They are small, portable ambassadors of a kingdom that once spanned seas. Yet these echoes are not confined to archaeology. In the living churches of Ethiopia, carved from rock or built of stone, in the processions of priests carrying ancient manuscripts, in the chanting of Gez hymns, the material and the spiritual blend. Aksum is not only remembered, it is still experienced. The kingdom may have slipped from power, but its stones remain rooted, its symbols still revered. They remind us that civilizations do not vanish. They change shape, leaving traces that call us to listen, to walk among them, to let the past speak. And in Aksum, the past speaks still, through every stone that catches the sun. When kingdoms fall, they do not vanish. They live on in the stories people tell. So it was with Aksum. Though its armies no longer marched and its coins no longer glittered, its memory flowed through chronicles, hymns, and whispered tales, shaping how later generations understood themselves and their past. The Ethiopian church was the chief guardian of memory. In monasteries hidden among cliffs and forests, monks copied manuscripts in Gez, scriptures, psalters, and histories that traced the Solomonic line back to Aksum's kings and, beyond them, to Solomon and Sheba. These texts did not record history as modern scholars would, but as sacred lineage, weaving fact with faith. For Ethiopians, Aksum was not just an empire, it was part of God's plan. Oral tradition also carried the past. Farmers and villagers remembered the towering stelae, calling them the graves of giants. Tales of King Ezana's conversion, of Frumentius, of Caleb's campaign in Arabia, these survived not as inscriptions, but as stories told by firelight, reshaped with each retelling. Even the figure of Gudit lived on, not as a name in stone, but as a legend of fire and fury. Foreign visitors, too, added to the narrative. Arab chroniclers recalled Aksum's role in offering refuge to Muhammad's early followers. Byzantine records spoke of its alliance in faith. Even centuries after its decline, travelers noted the ruins and marveled that such a kingdom had existed in Africa, though often with wonder tinged by myth. What is striking is how Aksum's memory was not of defeat, but of continuity. Later rulers, especially of the Solomonic dynasty, claimed Aksum as their foundation. By invoking its name, they strengthened their own legitimacy. To say one ruled Ethiopia was to say one inherited Aksum. In this way, memory was not passive, it was power, shaping identity and authority. Yet memory also softened Aksum, turning it from empire to symbol. The sharp edges of war and politics faded, leaving behind images of kings chosen by God, of crosses raised in stone, of a land that had always been faithful. Aksum became less a kingdom lost, and more a kingdom eternal, present in story, in liturgy, in imagination. Through narrative and memory, Aksum transcended its ruins. It ceased to be merely a chapter of history and became a part of Ethiopia's living soul. In the silence that followed Aksum's decline, its story was preserved through faith and memory. But in later centuries, another voice would join that chorus, the voice of scholars, piecing together fragments of stone, inscription, and soil to see the kingdom with clearer eyes. Their work did not replace tradition, it offered a different lens, one that sought not legend, but understanding. For centuries, much of the outside world knew Aksum only by scattered mentions, a line in Roman geography, a passage in Arab chronicles, a reference in Byzantine letters. To many, it seemed a distant echo, half myth, half forgotten. It was not until modern archaeology began its work in the 19th and 20th centuries that the kingdom of Aksum emerged again in fuller form. Excavations revealed what memory had hinted: the steely fields, the tombs of kings, the ruins of palaces and churches. Coins surfaced, bearing the faces of rulers from Indubis to Ezana, their inscriptions in Greek and Ge'ez. These coins, found as far as India and the Mediterranean, told of a kingdom deeply tied to the world beyond Africa. Inscriptions carved on stone, once buried, came to light again, recording campaigns, dedications, and prayers. The scholar's lens also uncovered the environmental story of Aksum. Studies of soil, rainfall, and vegetation revealed that climate change, deforestation, and overfarming played as great a role in the kingdom's decline as foreign rivals or internal strife. Aksum's fall was not a sudden catastrophe, but the result of many pressures, human and natural, woven together. In recent decades, discoveries like Beta Samarti added new depth. Here, in a modest town between Yar and Agilis, archaeologists found both pagan and Christian remains, revealing the transition of faith in everyday life. Such finds remind us that history is not only about kings and wars, but about the quiet persistence of communities. Through scholarship, Aksum has been restored not as myth or footnote, but as one of the great civilizations of antiquity, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Yet this lens, careful and critical, does not diminish the sacred memory. It complements it, showing how the stones align with the stories, how the earth confirms what was once sung in liturgy. The scholar's lens teaches us that history is both seen and remembered, a meeting of excavation and tradition. And in Aksum, the two together reveal a kingdom as enduring in truth as in faith. Long after its stele leaned and its palaces crumbled, Aksum lived on, not only in memory, but in imagination. Its name became a canvas upon which generations painted visions of kings and saints, of treasures hidden and promises unbroken. Where history fell silent, imagination spoke, and Aksum was reborn in legend. In the Ethiopian tradition, Aksum was not remembered as a kingdom that faded, but as a chosen land. It became the seat of the Ark of the Covenant, said to rest within the Church of St. Mary of Zion. Whether carried by Menelik, son of Solomon and Sheba, or brought in later ages, the Ark made Aksum the very heart of divine history. Pilgrims journeyed there not to see ruins, but to draw near to the presence of God's law. The stories of kings, too, were reimagined. Ezana became not only a ruler, but a model of the Christian sovereign, guiding his people by faith. Caleb, who crossed the sea to defend fellow Christians, was remembered as a saint, his campaign sanctified as holy war before the term was known. Even Gudit, feared destroyer, became part of the imaginative fabric, a symbol of judgment, a reminder that kingdoms fall when faith falters. In wider traditions, Aksum found its place as well. To Muslims, the Negus who sheltered the first followers of Muhammad remained a figure of justice, his kindness honored in hadith and story. To travelers from Europe and the Middle East, the tales of Ethiopia's Christian kings, heirs of Aksum, inspired wonder, feeding the legend of Prester John, the mysterious Christian monarch said to dwell in the far lands of the East. Artists and storytellers drew on Aksum's forms. The stelae were called towers of giants. The carved windows of ancient palaces inspired designs in later churches. Manuscript illuminations filled with crosses, stars, and vivid saints gave color to a kingdom whose stones had faded. Aksum became less a ruin than a mythic stage, upon which Ethiopia's destiny was always unfolding. Even in modern imagination, Aksum continues to live. Scholars see it as a symbol of Africa's deep antiquity, proof that the continent's civilization stood equal to Rome and Persia. Ethiopians see it as the wellspring of their faith and monarchy, a sacred inheritance. And poets, looking upon its stones, still hear whispers of an age when kings raised monuments to the sky. Thus Aksum endures, in imagination as much as in memory. Its empire may have fallen, but its image grew larger than life, shaping identity, belief, and wonder across 1,000 years. Looking back across the long arc of Aksum's story, the threads intertwine like the woven cloth still made in the highlands, each strand distinct, yet bound together in a single pattern. To understand Aksum is not only to recount kings and campaigns, but to see how faith, trade, power, and memory flowed together, shaping both its rise and its legacy. At its heart was trade. The Red Sea was Aksum's lifeline, connecting Africa to Arabia, India, and Rome. From this came wealth, coinage, and contact with distant worlds. But trade was never just commerce, it was also the medium through which new ideas and beliefs arrived. The Christian faith itself first touched Aksum through merchants and castaways, carried across the same waters that bore ivory and gold. This faith, once embraced, became Aksum's defining identity. Christianity did not erase the old traditions all at once, but absorbed and transformed them. The gods of war and sea gave way to the cross, yet their echoes remained in the structures of kingship and ritual. The Church, born in the age of Izana and Frumentius, endured long after the empire faded, ensuring that Aksum's legacy was not buried with its stones. Power, too, shaped the story. Aksum's kings ruled with both temporal authority and divine sanction. They minted coins to declare their sovereignty, raised stelae to proclaim their endurance, and led armies across seas to defend their faith. Yet power proved fragile. Shifting trade, environmental strain, and external rivals slowly eroded what monuments alone could not preserve. The fall of Aksum reminds us that even the strongest empires depend upon balances beyond their control. And yet, in memory, Aksum triumphed. Unlike many fallen kingdoms, it did not vanish into silence. It lived on in liturgy, in legend, in the stones that still stand beneath Ethiopian skies. Its name became part of Ethiopia's very soul, claimed by kings centuries later, sanctified in the church, remembered by neighbors near and far. Trade gave it wealth. Faith gave it soul. Power gave it stature. Memory gave it eternity. The synthesis of these themes shows Aksum not as an isolated story, but as part of the wider human journey of how civilizations rise, how they adapt, and how, even in decline, they endure. Aksum reminds us that history is more than monuments, it is the weaving of human lives, bound together in resilience and belief. And in that weaving, Aksum still shines. To walk among the stelae of Aksum is to feel the weight of ages pressing gently upon the present. The stones lean, the carvings soften, yet the wonder endures. For Aksum is not only a tale of the past, it is a presence, still alive in memory, faith, and the very air of the Ethiopian highlands. What makes Aksum endure in wonder is not simply its monuments, though they astonish the eye. It is the sense of a kingdom that stood at the crossroads of worlds. It was African, yet engaged with Rome, Persia, Arabia, and India. It was ancient, yet among the first to embrace Christianity as a public faith. It was imperial in reach, yet humble in its mountain setting. Its uniqueness lies in this balance, a kingdom at once local and universal. There is wonder, too, in its continuity. Though empires rise and fall, few leave behind so unbroken a thread. The language of Aksum lives on in Gez chant. Its liturgy still sanctifies Ethiopian worship. Its traditions of art, music, and architecture echo in every carved cross, every sung psalm, every church raised in stone. To see Aksum is not to gaze upon a vanished civilization, but to recognize a living one, whose roots reach back unbroken through centuries. Aksum also endures as a symbol of resilience. It withstood shifting climates, foreign pressures, and internal divisions. Even when it ceased to be an empire, it chose survival over collapse, retreating into the highlands, nurturing its faith, and preserving its memory. In this quiet endurance lies a lesson that greatness is not only in expansion, but in the ability to last. For Ethiopians, Aksum is more than history. It is a source of identity, a link to Solomon and Sheba, a testimony to divine favor. For the wider world, it is a reminder that Africa has always stood among the great civilizations of the earth, shaping and shaped by the global currents of its time. The wonder of Aksum lies not only in what it was, but in what it remains, a kingdom of stone and spirit, still speaking across centuries, still offering a glimpse of eternity in its weathered monuments. And so, in its silence, Aksum continues to inspire awe. The story of Aksum does not end in conquest, nor in silence, but in endurance. Its empire has long passed, its armies no longer march, its coins no longer shine. Yet the stones remain, watching, weathered, whispering. In their stillness, they tell us that civilizations never truly vanish. They change, they fade, they endure in new forms. Walk among the stelae, and you hear it. The granite monoliths, carved with windows and doors, stand like guardians of memory. Though some lie broken, they whisper of kings who sought eternity, of artisans who labored with precision, of a people who believed in permanence. Their message is not of ruin, but of resilience. Listen in the churches, and you hear it. The chants of Gez, ancient and solemn, rise in the same words first spoken in Ezana's day. The liturgy carries the voice of Aksum across centuries, a song unbroken. It whispers that faith outlives empire, that prayer endures beyond the rise and fall of kings. Look into the traditions, and you see it. In every carved cross, in every illuminated manuscript, in every rock-hewn sanctuary, Aksum's spirit lingers. Its forms live on in the present, not as relics, but as living inheritance. The stones whisper that culture survives not in grandeur alone, but in daily devotion, in memory, in the quiet strength of people who do not forget. And beyond Ethiopia, Aksum's whisper travels still. In Islamic tradition, the Negus who sheltered Muhammad's followers is remembered with gratitude. In Christian memory, Caleb is honored as a saint. In world history, Aksum stands as a reminder that Africa was never silent, but spoke with power and vision. The whisper of the stones is gentle, but clear. It tells us that greatness lies not only in the wealth of kings or the reach of armies, but in the endurance of faith, memory, and identity. Aksum was once an empire. Now it is more of a presence, a heritage, a testimony carved in stone and sung in prayer. The stones whisper. And if we listen, we hear not only Aksum's story, but the story of all who seek to last.